I'd like to welcome you back now to the second panel at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, and this is security in Asia. The beginning of November, we had the 153rd Bergedorf Roundtable in Jakarta on the topic of peace and security in the Asian Pacific region. And one of the results of the roundtable was that armament in the complete Asian Pacific region increases the danger of violent escalation of already existing conflicts there. Furthermore, many participants were of the opinion that the relationship between China and the U.S. dominates the security situation in the region. At this panel on security in Asia, we'd now like to discuss the central security policy challenges in Asia. And I'm very happy that we were really able to put together an excellent panel on this topic. I'd like to welcome Alka Acharya, professor for Chinese studies in New Delhi and member of the National Security Advisory Body of the government. Then we are very happy to have the former Chinese ambassador to Malaysia, Pakistan, Indonesia, and India, Zhou. Since 2008, he's a permanent member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Committee of the government in China. Then I'd like to welcome the Foreign Policy and Security Advisor to the Federal Chancellor Merkel, Christoph Heusgen, and professor at the Columbia University, New York, and current fellow with the American Academy, and Nathan, and then head of International Strategic Intelligence, Rizal, Sukma from Jakarta. Thomas Paulsen, Executive Director, International Affairs of the Körber Foundation, will moderate this panel. Well, and we look forward to an interesting debate.
Thank you very much. When we visited Jakarta, as Klaus has mentioned, a few weeks ago for our Bergedorf Roundtable to discuss security issues in the Asia-Pacific region, I think we met a very complex security situation in the region, characterized by modernization of military capabilities, in a way a securitization of the political process in many countries. We have seen a proliferation of defense white papers. National security councils have been established or are about to be established, and we see a whole lot of unresolved territorial disputes mixed with a dose of nationalism in many cases. I would like to try to structure our discussion and address three issues for this discussion. First one is shed more light on what are the current security issues in the region. Secondly, what kind of key elements can we imagine when it comes to some kind of a security structure in the region? And thirdly, what can we expect from Europe when it comes to security in Asia? When I saw the newspapers this morning, the German newspapers, the headline was about the security situation in the East China Sea. We have read in the news that China a few days ago has established a ADIZ, the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, which overlaps the Japanese ADIZ, which was established, I think, in 1960. And it has met a harsh reaction by Japan and also the United States. And my first question goes to Ambassador Zhou. And I would like to ask you, when I look at Japan and China, and also during our roundtable in Jakarta, this was the most tense session about security situation in the East China Sea. When I look at Japan and China, I have this picture in mind of two tankers moving very slowly towards each other, and no tanker or no captain is able or willing to change course or even slow down a little bit. And how long can these two tankers continue with this collision course until we really get a serious problem? Is there any way out of this situation?
Thank you. As you know, China and Japan are two major countries in Asia, and they are second and third biggest economy in the world. So China attaches great importance with its relations with Japan. So we have contributed a lot since the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Japan since 1972. Of course, today we have some problems. It is caused not by the Chinese side, but by Japan. Take the Diaoyudao and its affiliated islands. For example, these islands, the Diaoyudao and the other small islands, belong to China from ancient times. It's the Chinese who first discovered and named and administrated these islands. But these islands occupied, taken by Japan in 1895 war, when war was defeated. But during the Second World War II, according to the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation, all these islands occupied by Japan should be returned to China. But as you know, the United States take a hostile policy towards China after the founding of the People's Republic of China. So the United States unilaterally handed over the administration of the islands to Japan in the beginning of the 1970s. This is the cause of the problem. So I think for Japan, it should face the reality, respect the history and the facts, and to have a correct understanding and recognition of the results of the Second World War II, not challenge the outcome of the Second Anti-Fascist War, not to try to change the post-war order in this area. So I think this trend attracts attention not from its neighbors, who used to be suffered greatly from Japanese aggression during the Second World War. As you just mentioned, the ADIZ, I think it is the correct measures taken by the Chinese government with the aim to safeguard the state sovereignty and the airspace security over these areas. And this measure, I think, is not a new one. It used to be taken by other countries as well. So far, over 20 countries have claimed such areas, including Japan. And the measures taken by the Chinese government is not directed against any third country. It will be helpful and useful to maintain peace and stability in this region.
Don't you see a danger of accidental or some other kind of military escalation if you have two overlapping ADIZ?
As you know, you can judge from the policy, the actions of the Chinese government for the last 1 year and more. China is used to be very prudent and cautious. We are trying our best to avoid any conflict, especially in the military field with Japan. So it's up to Japan to take a positive attitude.
Okay. I mean, you didn't really convince me that the Chinese side the Chinese tanker is ready to slow down or change the course, but we will have more time to discuss this issue in the panel. I would like to ask my next question to Professor Nathan. The United States has a security alliance with Japan, and to which extent is this a reliable security guarantee when it comes to, and I exaggerate a little bit just to make the point, some uninhabited islands? Would the United States be prepared to go to war for these islands?
First, let me say I'm not representing any government. I'm just an independent academic analyst. This question of the reliability of American commitments is always there. It's there in Europe. It's there in Asia. It's been there for many, many decades, at least since the end of the war in Vietnam. So that's a bit of a context. If I could also give a little macro context on the dispute, I think China faces many security challenges, both internally and around its borders. And so as its economy has grown, it's natural that China wants to improve its ability to defend itself. And one of the obstacles that it faces in having that ability is that it's surrounded by American deployments, American alliances, the first island chain and so forth. So I think China has an intent to improve its security posture in Asia step by step. Now, that's the situation that the U.S. and Japan are looking at, is China's growing and it's trying to improve its security position. Now, the U.S. position, as I say, I'm not a spokesman, but I know what the U.S. government position is that it doesn't take any stand on who has sovereignty, who ought to have sovereignty over this disputed Senkaku Islands, but that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty covers the defense of any territory that Japan holds, which includes the Senkakus, and hence the U.S. would be committed to abide by the terms of the treaty and assist in the defense of Japan in the case of an armed clash. But what would that involve? Going to war with China? Probably not. First of all, I don't really think China is going to push it to a war. There is the issue of miscalculation you point to correctly, but I don't believe China's strategy is to have a war with Japan. In fact, the Japanese Coast Guard is very, very competent, and a war around those islands would very possibly be lost by the Chinese forces. So in any case, I think it would be not in China's interest for its relations with its entire region to trigger an armed conflict. But if there were an armed conflict, I don't think that the Japanese would require the deployment of American forces into that theater. They might want some intelligence assistance. They really don't need any help. But the short answer is yes. On this issue, the U.S., I'm sure, would abide by its treaty commitments. And the reason for that, in short, is that things are changing in Asia. The Chinese are moving to improve their position, and the U.S. needs to have that process result in a balance between American and Chinese security interests. If the U.S. doesn't abide by its treaty commitments, it will just fundamentally undermine its entire position, not only in Asia, but also in Europe.
Any ideas you are aware of from the American side how to contribute to a détente in the
well, the U.S.
how to diffuse the situation?
Yeah, the U.S. has been pressing the Chinese not to what is called unilaterally change the situation. So, I mean, you may say pressing the Chinese is not a constructive measure, but it is a necessary thing, I think, for Washington to work with the Chinese and say, you know, this is dangerous and you should. And on the other side, I don't know whether the U.S. government has done this, but I know that a lot of Track 2 types have been urging the Japanese to do what China wants here, and which I think is the Chinese goal, which is to get Japan to acknowledge that there is a dispute over the Senkaku Islands sovereignty. And I think many Americans believe that if the Japanese would acknowledge that, then the crisis would settle down for a period of time. So these are two, you know, in other words, to pressure both sides is basically what the U.S. has been Again, I don't know what the U.S. government has said to Japan, but I mean, your question is what can the U.S. do? I think that's what it can do, is to talk to both sides.
Okay, thank you. Professor Acharya, India has its own unresolved issues with China, and at the same time there's a very dynamic security situation developing in the Indian Ocean, with India playing a major role, but also China being more active, the United States very active. What is the Indian experience in dealing with the big neighbor, China, and also dealing with these unresolved issues that you have?
You know, I think the Sino-Indian relationship has traveled a great deal from the time when we fought a war over the territory and thereafter initiated steps to handle what was clearly fast becoming a very asymmetrical situation. China was much more powerful, much more equipped than India, and at the same time realizing that the regional situation did not really offer many alternatives if the India-China relationship went on a collision course. I think the two things really become very significant, and that takes place mainly in the last 2 decades. One is a realization, and this is a post-Cold War kind of a scenario, where gradually you have, as the forces of globalization start to take strength and the whole story of Asia coming into its own starts to emerge, it exerts a certain kind of pressure on both India and China about the importance of keeping this relationship within, to the extent possible, predictable, manageable proportions. In other words, we do not let the territorial issue go out of hand and trigger possible flare-ups which could have disastrous consequences. The second was that security starts to, I think, acquire many more dimensions, particularly in the last decade and a half in Asia. While traditional security concerns continue to exercise their hold, and I think we must understand India is one of the largest weapons exporters, and this is with an eye to the greater capabilities of its northern neighbor, but also with the many challenges that are emerging within the region. But on the other hand, it's not just about security between states. The entire security discourse, and we can see what a vibrant discourse there is in India today, that it's not just about security between states, but security within states as well. There is a certain progressive, a certain emancipatory dimension to the question of security. We have now a number of issues coming on board. There's economic security, there is threats within the region, within countries, particularly those emanating from terrorism. There are a whole host of issues allied to economic security, such as energy security. All these have begun to impinge on relations between states as well. And somewhere this broader security discourse has also fed into the way in which India-China relations have unfolded, particularly in the last decade. So on the one hand, you have very straightforward, systematic political processes which are trying to control the way in which the disputes are being handled. On the other hand, there is a broadening, a diversifying, a deepening of the Sino-Indian interaction, because we need many more platforms to start talking about the newer threats to security. The water issue. Now, the last 5 years has seen the emergence of water. There is a great deal of uncertainty within India, and I think somewhere the Chinese have just begun to realize about the impact of the dams that they are building has on concerns within India. And so this has come onto the bilateral platform in a major way. Similarly, there is a question of, you mentioned the securitization of political issues. I think we have a tremendous securitization of economic issues as far as India-China are concerned. The whole issue of energy security, Again, it's a question of China's internal problems, but it is impacting on India because we feel that there is a strong discourse within India which feels that China is trying to surround India with bases and so on. So I think what we need to see is, on the one hand, what has really been achieved between the two states to manage what are called traditional security threats, and on the other hand, the opening up of the security discourse in Asia particularly.
Do you see, I mean, you have written extensively on China. Do you see any changes happening in Chinese foreign policy since President Xi became president?
Well, it's too early really to talk about changes, but we have observed that there is continuity in terms of the importance that India will occupy as far as China's new foreign policy is concerned. The stress on building a more stable relationship has been reiterated often. So there are, at this point, more continuities to be seen than changes. Of course, this comes in the wake, and I am now talking of two levels at which the China threat is discussed within the Indian political and security establishment. There is, and there is no point in brushing it under the carpet, a great deal of unease about, within the political and particularly the strategic communities, about what is seen as more assertive China in the region. On this ground, there has been a lot of discourse. I think there is a difference in with which some people tend to look at this, but the fact is that it has also been a part of the political dialogue. And there is, we believe, some effort at dispelling some of these kind of ideas. But that has made an impact on the way in which the Indian political and strategic community is trying to position itself in terms of the security threat that is perceived.
Thank you. I will give you the chance.
As Dr. Alka Acharya is my old friend, because
you're in the same eminent first school, isn't it?
No. Yeah, right. We know each other for the last 15 years. So I would like to say a few words about China-Indian relations. These are two neighbors with common border, over 2,000 kilometers long. We are two old civilizations in the world. We are two biggest populous countries in the world, and two fast developing economies in the world as well. So these two countries share many things in common. We have similar views on many problems, both domestic and international. So the urgent task both for India and China is to accelerate economic development and to improve the living standard of our peoples. So China views India as a good partner, a good friend, and also a good neighbor. We are trying to build a new type of relationship between the two biggest neighbors, while properly handling the differences between us. At present, both China and India take the relations to the other side as its priority of its foreign policy. So the cooperation and friendship and good neighborliness between the two biggest populous countries in the world is of global strategic importance and is good for maintaining peace, stability, and security, not only for our two countries, but also in the South Asian subcontinent and beyond for the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sukma, we just heard Professor Acharya saying that there's a perception among some policymakers in India that Chinese behavior has become more assertive. What is your experience in the South China Sea? Indonesia, I think, is the only country which does not have a direct territorial dispute with China. But at the same time, there are lots of other disputes with China, but also among other states in the region. How do you assess the situation in the South China Sea?
Well, the way the Indonesians look at the situation, it actually presents both opportunity and also some worries, if you like. On one hand, of course, it is actually natural, to see that China is becoming more assertive, as its powers, become more powerful and economically and militarily. But at the same time, we also believe that, there is still a lot of, space, for China and not only climate states of ASEAN, but also with ASEAN as a whole, to try, to discuss the issue and then, try to agree on, a set of code of conduct so that, we can actually manage, the potential for tensions or incidents or accidents over the South China Sea, even though, of course, I think both China and ASEAN also believe that it's not realistic, to expect that, this sovereignty issue can be resolved, for the next, say, 20 to 30 years. So our main challenge now is actually how to agree on, a set of code of conduct so that, accident, can be avoided and then, further tension, can be actually reduced. But again, if you look at the Indonesian, position on that particular issue, we have had a very difficult relationship with China before. But it will take time also, for Indonesian to 100% trust China, even though over the last 15 years the relationship has improved a lot. So I think there is a lot of growing confidence and trust in China within Indonesia's foreign policy and defense establishment so far. But of course we need to continue to nurture that kind of relationships and also trust in the future. I'm afraid I have to say that the Chinese policy toward this South China Sea issue, especially from 2009, 2011, raised a lot of questions as well, within Indonesia. But, after the last Congress, we become more optimistic again, that the conciliate, more like, positive response, from China, especially, from Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and also the fact that there have been at least 3 talks so far over the last 3 or 4 months. And then, a new joint working group has been formed, in order to talk about, the code of conduct, between China and ASEAN on the South China Sea, especially after the Zhou meeting a couple of weeks ago, which I think, give us a more, I think, solid ground, for, optimism. But of course, we all have to be patient, and then it will take, I think, more time before we can all, agree on the final form of the code of conduct.
When we look at what happened at the Scarborough show between the Philippines and China, what are the conclusions that Indonesia and other countries draw from that, what has happened there? Because obviously the United States did not intervene and help the Philippines in their struggle over the Scarborough shoal. What are the conclusions that you draw from this?
ASEAN, like the US, also doesn't take side, on who actually own, those islands, rocks, or atolls, or whatever you have, in that area. So when it comes to these Scarborough shoals, but I think, we try, to look at on the positive side. That until today, it's really clear, that neither China nor Philippines actually resort, to the military force, in order to try, to resolve this issue. Even though, of course, the danger, that this dispute actually become, the military incident is there. That's, I think, still quite, giving us a degree of assurance that rationality still, guides, those countries, especially China and the Philippines. But at the same time, the lessons that we draw, at least, in a number of circles, in ASEAN countries, China is becoming more difficult, to actually ask, more difficult to ask them, to actually compromise. And in fact, from my point of view, I don't see why, for example, as a great power, China is actually giving a little bit. So exactly like in the way like Indonesia was dealing with Malaysia, we have so many islands, we just give it to Malaysia, to islands, in the dispute. So I think, because China is a greater power here, of course, we expect that China would be more understanding, in that context. That will also build, a lot of trust, a lot of, I think, new confidence, in the region, rather than, actually trying to stay, on the military course or on the pressure, in order to actually get whatever it can, from the Philippines, in that context.
Okay. Dr. Heusgen, when you listen to what we just have heard, these conflicts in the East China Sea and the situation in the South China Sea, Europe delivers weapons to some of the countries in the region. At the same time, when I look at our draft for the Grand Coalition Agreement on Foreign Policy, we speak of Japan as our friend. China and India are strategic partners. How long can Europe stay out of these conflicts evolving in the region?
Well, who says that we stay outside these conflicts? You mentioned in the introduction, you said that the US and Japan had expressed a concern about what has happened with regard to the air defense identification zone. Yesterday, the German government spokesman also made it clear that for the German government, we see this development and this new declaration by the Chinese government with great concern, and with great concern for the stability in the region. So we do not stay out of these conflicts, quite the contrary. We believe it is also in Europe's and Germany's interest that the conflicts in the regions are resolved in a peaceful way, because we depend very much on stability in that region. When you look at, for a country as Germany, which is very dependent on trade and exports and imports, then our trade with Asia is more than double than what we have with North America. And when you look at all the different sea routes that go through Asia, half of global trade goes through these sea routes. So, of course, Germany has a very great interest in having stability in the region. So, no, we are not eager and we will not send our defense forces there. But, of course, politically, we try to make a contribution to peaceful settlement of the different conflicts. There is the Asian Regional Forum, where the German government, European Union contributes with a lot of seminars on confidence-building measures and on with proposals how these conflicts are resolved. And what we try to convey to our Asian friends is that on the one hand, of course, Europe's history, culture is different from Asia's history and culture, but nevertheless, I think one can draw some conclusions from the way that we have handled our conflicts in Europe after the Second World War, by having the European Union, by having the rule of law, by having structures, mechanisms installed which guarantee that conflicts are solved in a peaceful way. So what we then support in the region are mechanisms that I think you have just mentioned before, the code of conduct that ASEAN and China have not agreed upon but working on, and we are encouraged by the first meetings of senior civil servants, ASEAN and China, who talk about code of conduct. I would nevertheless like, and maybe I can, if you may, I can turn to Chinese colleague and pick up of what you mentioned, a conflict that is not that much in the media here in Europe, but when you look at it, it's very, for me also very concerning. This is a Scarborough Shoal case, because from international law, this is a case where within the 200-mile zone of the Philippines, there is a disputed island or reef, and then the Philippines tried to resolve it with arbitration and using actually mechanism that our Asian friends have set up, the so-called UNCLOS mechanism. And I would like to hear from our Chinese colleague why China doesn't use this mechanism to contribute to a peaceful resolution of that issue.
Ambassador, why don't you answer the question right away?
I agree with my friends from Indonesia, because I used to be ambassador to Jakarta from 1995 to 1998. So it is quite natural for friends from the West to be worried about the possible escalation of the conflict of interest, about the possible deterioration of situation in our areas. but we people in China, we are quite optimistic. Why? Because if you look Asia as a whole, it is the region in the world with the most fast economic development. And the weight, the role of Asia in today's world is increasing. And the whole world attaches great importance to the future development of Asia, including the major countries in this region, China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others. So I think both China and other Asian neighbors attach great importance to our relations, to our friendship, to our cooperation. Look at the example. Only recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Li Keqiang paid an official visit to Malaysia and Indonesia, and also to attend APEC summit. And also, Prime Minister Li Keqiang visited Brunei Darussalam, Thailand, and Vietnam. So it sent a very positive signal that we attach great importance to our relations with all ASEAN countries. So we are trying our best to put our differences under effective control.
So why did China choose not to use some international arbitration or other mechanisms that are here for the Scarborough Shoal?
As for the Chinese attitude towards the Philippines, we actually have our reservation about the international arbitration on the South China Sea, because it is according to our experience, it is better for the parties directly involved in the dispute to resolve these problems through peaceful and candid consultations and dialogue.
So it's rather, you're saying that China wants to negotiate these issues bilaterally, and if it doesn't work, to negotiate a solution, then...
In fact, we had made some progress. If you look carefully at the current visits by President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Li Keqiang, we further upgrade our strategic partnership with Indonesia and Malaysia. We agreed with Vietnam to take steps to conduct possible cooperation in the disputed area between China and Vietnam. So my advice to our friends present here is to look the general picture of the situation, to look at the mainstream of the situation, to weigh the positive aspects of the things. If you look at China's relations with its neighbors, I personally witnessed the improvement and development of China's relations with Malaysia. I was there from the end of the 80s to the beginning of the 90s. I witnessed the fast improvement and the enhancing mutual trust between China and Indonesia. And I witnessed further deepening and developing the all-weather friendship and all-dimensional cooperation between China and Pakistan. And also I witnessed the fast improvement of relations between China and India. This is our policy. This is our desire. Our policy, I think, is very successful and welcomed by our neighbors.
Okay. Professor Nathan, obviously the Chinese-American relationship is strategically key to many things that happens in East China Sea and South China Sea and in the whole of Asia. And it's a very complex relationship with human rights issues, economic issues, security issues, and many other issues. At the same time, we hear that there's a lot of talk going on but the concrete outcome is not, there's not a lot of concrete outcome, concrete projects that really work. How do you see that strategic trust, to use that term, between the United States and China can grow in this situation? Or what do you suggest?
With respect to the territorial disputes?
Yeah, strategic trust about how to deal with each other in Asia.
Yeah.
And how
well,
to prevent
as you say, it's a very complex relationship with many different strands in it, and I think, in fact, there's a lot of cooperation that goes on. The two economies are complementing each other in a host of ways and so forth. There's a great deal of educational and intellectual exchange. There's strategic cooperation between the two sides around issues like Korea, North Korea, Iran, other Security Council issues. Not that the Chinese and the Americans ever, or at least very seldom, have 100% overlapping positions, but I think there's a tremendous amount of cooperation on strategic issues. But issues are difficult and they have to be negotiated. It takes time, it takes friction, it takes, it's a process. And so we can always find those areas in which the U.S.-China relationship is engaged in that process of adjustment. And I think particularly what I was talking about before, that as China grows more wealthy, it wants to improve its security posture. And I think we should understand the tremendous importance of both the South China Sea and the East China Sea for hundreds of years indefinitely into the future to China's security, military security, in terms of having as much of those contested territories as it can get economic security because of the sea lanes, fisheries, oil. So this is a big deal. These are not peripheral areas that China can just say, well, give and take. They need to get as much of it as they can. And I think they don't want to fight a war for that. As I said before, that would be quite counterproductive for them in lots and lots of ways, especially if they didn't win. But even if they did. But what they want to do is to negotiate it when their position is optimal. Not go rushing off to the international court and settle it now. They're not that hot to settle these issues. What they want to do is build up the Navy, build up their diplomatic influence and their economic influence, and when they have the best possible position, that would be the time to settle these things peacefully. I may have wandered off the exact question that you were asking, but I think in that situation, the U.S., what I think is trying to do is to manage this rise, as Rizal said, which is inevitable, of China, manage it in a way that it doesn't at the same time detract from the U.S. posture in Asia, which is extremely important to the U.S. I haven't explained why that is, but that's probably pretty obvious. The U.S. doesn't want to get out of Asia. And doesn't want to abandon its allies and doesn't want to weaken its stake in the region. So how can you do both things, have the rise of China without a decline of the U.S.? Well, that's a day-to-day management issue. It's partly deterrence, it's partly hedging, it's partly confidence-building measures, and so on and so forth. And I would say that process is happening. We don't see a headline every day about it, but I think it's happening. I think mill-to-mill contacts are something that the U.S. has really wanted to do and sees as very necessary to managing this process, and the Chinese have been reluctant to get into it, partly because they view it as a form of intimidation, actually. Look at my aircraft carrier kind of a thing, and also because I think the Chinese feel that if they expose their military to the West, the military will suffer from ideological erosion and corruption issues, which they have anyway, but that will be worse. And so mill-to-mill is a thing the U.S. is pushing, and China's only slowly acceding to that idea.
Professor Acharya, Deputy Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter has recently said that the U.S. pivot to Asia hinges on India, on a strong India. Do you see India as part of the American pivot to Asia?
Who said that? Who said that?
Ashton Carter.
I see.
Deputy.
Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Okay.
Well, much would depend on what you are implying by India being a very crucial part of the US pivot. If by that one implies that India would be prepared to give up some of its strategic autonomy and fall in with the US objectives in the region, I would say no. I think what we are seeing really is definitely a very close cooperation between the United States and India, particularly after the entire dialogue on civilian nuclear cooperation began. They're of course big trade partners, huge amounts of interaction in the educational, cultural, scientific arenas. So we do have a very close cooperative relationship, but to the extent to which India would be a part of this US pivot is, I think, a hugely debated question. There is really no unanimity within the country as to what would constitute this falling in with the larger objectives that are implied in the US pivot. I think somewhere what underlies this debate, and it has to do as much with, as I said, the broadening of our whole understanding of security, is that we've seen how divisive the US role has been in terms of dividing Asian countries on this side or that side of various kinds of organizations or debates, or even polarizing some of the security issues in the region. So there would be two strands. One is, of course, that India would not like to enter into any scenario which would add to that divisiveness within Asia. I think India is also looking to somewhere playing a leading role in the kind of debates that Asia is beginning to start, particularly in the security arena. There would also be one very important strand which would relate to the Sino-Indian question, and whether the pivot would somewhere impact the Sino-Indian relations, which in turn would have a further divisive role in Asia. I think for both India and China, it is important not to have the Asian countries playing sides or moving on with this camp or the other. It's important that even as differences between the Chinese and the Indians are fairly obvious on a whole lot of issues, it's important to see this not as something which is going to strategically divide a wedge in the way in which the Asian story is beginning to. Somewhere the larger issues can come together in terms of common interests, and the different or the problematic areas can continue to be a question of dialogue. I think if you look at the entire issues between India and China on the one hand, there is a greater degree of frankness with which both sides have been putting their problems on the table. I think the question of China-Pakistan relationship has increasingly now been put between the two sides, because there are clear concerns in India about the Sino-Pakistani linkage. Similarly, the kind of questions that arise when China is working with our neighbors, which have been put on the table. So I think we need to see that even as there is what I would call a geopolitical knee-jerk reaction to many things that is happening, on the other hand, you do have geoeconomics, and now increasingly the ecological, environmental, developmental, sustainable issues which are going to bear down on this. So I think the pivot really will have to be consigned or confined to a very narrow geopolitical discourse, which is...
Thank you. Dr. Sukma, let's spend some minutes on the question of
on pivot.
No. Excuse me?
You want me to comment on pivot? Or?
No. I wanted to ask you on the perspective of a regional security structure. Christoph Heusgen has already mentioned the European experience, basically talking about the CSCE experience. What would be, from your point of view, the 3 or 4 most important key elements of such a security structure?
We all actually in East Asia are talking about the new emerging regional architecture. In fact, as an ASEAN a member, I do believe that you need to have at least 3 types of order in East Asia. Number one is of course the so-called realist order. So I do believe that some sort of balance of power among the major powers, among the great powers, is necessary. The second order, what we call the institutional, orders, there, where we all within ASEAN believe that some sort of institutions is actually needed. So that's, the so-called the ASEAN-centered institutions such as the ASEAN +1, the ADMM, the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, you name it, all these ASEAN-driven institutions. So we do believe that institution can also modify state behavior. The third order, which we call the normative order, in East Asia, because we also are working very hard in order, to set some kind of like norms, for the regions which, everybody can actually observe, in order to conduct, its, interstate relation with each other. So these are, I think, the 3 elements that, we believe that should be, the overarching framework, for the new emerging regional security architecture, in East Asia. So even though within that context, we also see that it is impossible, to actually choose, which one that you really want, because the 3 orders actually can complement with each other. For example, the US-led alliances, this is important. We recognize the contribution it has made over the last 40, 50 years, to the security of East Asia. But at the same time, we also, put a lot of hopes, in the importance of the ASEAN-driven institution. We can actually, provide a space for major powers and also for middle powers and smaller powers actually, to share and then, talk to each other about, how the region should be structured in the future.
Ambassador Zhou, when you listen to Dr. Sukma, are you getting interested in some kind of overarching architecture, or would you rather remain on the bilateral level with your neighbors?
No. Actually, the security situation in Asia is more complicated than those in Europe, because of the different history, culture, ideology, and social system, and also different level of economic development. But recent years, I think countries in our region, including ASEAN, are trying our best to enhance the mutual trust, to improve our political relationship, to strengthen our win-win cooperation. So build the basis for building up a new mechanism for ensuring the common security for both of us. So as you know, China advocates a new security concept. A concept, the feature of this concept is mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, and coordination. This security should be comprehensive, involving different aspects, political, economic, diplomatic, and others. It should be common security, a security for all, not for one of a particular country, not for the big country only, and also a cooperative security, a security through cooperation, and by ensuring security to promote cooperation.
Do you have any concrete, maybe 1 or 2 concrete proposals how to improve this?
So I think in this respect, the regional cooperation, such as SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, and also SAARC, can play quite an important role to promote the mutual trust between the parties concerned. So I would like to say a few words about a very important factor out of our region, that's the United States. As U.S. is the biggest developed country in the world, and China is the biggest developing country in the world, So China attaches great importance with our relations with the United States. And we think that U.S.-China relations, these bilateral relations, is one of the most important relationships in the world today, in the sense for maintaining world peace, promoting economic development, and strengthening win-win cooperation among all members of the international community. You see, today's relations between the U.S. and China is not that of the relationship some years back, in the beginning of founding of the People's Republic of China, during the Korean War, in the 70s during Chinese Cultural Revolution, even not in the late 90s in the last century. Now we are trying to build a new type of great country relationship, the major country relationship between China and the United States. The main feature of this new kind of relationship is no confrontation.
Thank you very much. I think we have one more point. Yeah.
The mutual respect and win-win cooperation. We have over 90 bilateral mechanisms between China and the United States. We have exceeded almost $500 billion in our bilateral trade. We have every year over 3.6 million tourists between our two countries. So that's why I think it's important for China and the United States to further enhance our mutual trust, strengthen our cooperation. One word, I think in this sense, it's not for China to be worried about India-U.S. relations. Sometimes the Indian friends told me they are worried about the close relationship between China and the United States.
Thank you. Professor Nathan, it's clear that the American-Chinese relationship is hugely important for Asia. How can Europe, or how should Europe come into play? Any expectations?
Well, I think we probably all agree that Europe does have a tremendous stake in Asia, you said so, in the stability of the region, even though the Europeans don't deploy military forces there, which makes their interest quite different from that of the U.S., but nonetheless, in a strategic sense, the military stability of the region and its political stability and its economic prosperity and all of those things really are very, very important to Europe, not to mention the importance of the non-traditional security issues, climate change, everything like that. Europe is very closely tied. And the question is, I guess, what works and what would help? And it seems to me that, I mean, my view is that the Europeans in general, I agree that it's not that they don't do anything. I absolutely agree with you there, Germany or Europe as a whole, but that Europe is stronger than it thinks in dealing with these issues, and it would be still stronger if it were more united. Now, I know that's a big agenda, very, very difficult to achieve, but in particular with respect to China, Germany is extremely important to China and has a very strong economic position and is also China's most important diplomatic partner in this whole region. And I think that the Europeans, the Germans alone and with European partners could be stronger on issues that are of security importance to you. Now, the Chinese diplomats are very skillful in dividing the Europeans, so now they're punishing the Norwegians for awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. They will punish the Spanish because the Spanish courts have indicted some Chinese leaders. And I think that they punish Germany for a little bit and France for inviting the Dalai Lama to meet the head of state. I would wish that the Europeans would stick together on these issues. So the fact is that the Spanish courts operate independently and they may have done the wrong thing or the right thing, but the principle is they operate independently, and the executive, the foreign policy of that country should not be held hostage. The same thing with the Nobel Peace Prize, and all the Europeans should get together around that issue. That's my view, and other similar issues.
Christoph Heusgen gets the last word to answer these points, and then we will open the floor for the Q&A.
Yes. Of course, we are aware in Europe about the limitations of the influence that we have, but when you look at what is happening in bilateral relations, in EU-Asian relations, a lot more happens than many people believe. Even when it comes to resolving national crises and problems. Some may remind you that one of the EU operations in 2005 and 6 actually happened in Indonesia, where it was the European Union that settled a conflict between the Indonesian government and the Free Aceh movement, where this was at the time President Artisari, who was very instrumental in resolving that, and the EU then deployed some 100 observers to see that this domestic conflict is resolved, and we did that successfully. So we can do something if we are asked, and our experience of resolving these kind of conflicts is there, and I think we can and should. We are ready to play a role. With regard to the European Union, we have over time developed really a common policy, and when you look in particular in the trade and economic area, we have achieved a lot, and by having all the forces united, we can then right now try with Japan to get a free trade agreement. We got a free trade agreement EU with South Korea, and we are trying to get more deals with other countries. Now, there is always a question, how does this relate, the EU operation, the EU activities, how do they relate with bilateral activities? And there, of course, it is true that Germany is the strongest economic partner, and we have our very close bilateral relations, not only with China, we have it with India, we have it, Chancellor was in Indonesia, Chancellor was in Singapore, so we try to be present. We have installed regular intergovernmental consultations with China and India. But when we do that, of course, it is because we have German national interest, economic interests, but other interests, of course, as well. But we always try to connect with the European Union, so that whenever we have these visits or German-Chinese intergovernmental consultations, we go to Brussels and see what is on the agenda, and so we try to coordinate, because we don't think that bilateral relations and EU relations with the region or the countries are exclusive, but they should be complementary. I would like, if I may, nevertheless go back to the earlier topic very briefly when we discussed the Philippines problem with the ambassador, where he said that from his perspective, bilateral relations bilateral contacts would resolve these crises. Of course, it is easily said, I think, for a country of the size and economic and military power to say, okay, we want to do it and we want to do it bilaterally. But when you look a bit at the conflicts that China has, and we talked about the conflict with Japan, the conflict which is with the air defense identification zone, also relates to South Korea. We talked about the Philippines, Vietnam has problems, Malaysia has problems. So there are many issues. Again, I hold that going back to the European experience also for China, for the region, it would serve the interest of stability much more if you actually entered into these multilateral fora that you have helped to establish yourself, but you are not not using. So while you say that the experience is that bilaterally you make more progress, I'm not convinced on that. I think that you should perhaps try a bit more to work in these fora. The same holds true, by the way, with ASEAN. There I also think that ASEAN, while it's an old standing organization and that has done a very good job, but it still hasn't done the last step that the European Union has done by giving in parts of sovereignty, by having not always unanimous decisions, but go to majority decisions. And then when in the case of Philippines, somebody is on, in the focus, that maybe you close ranks and go together. So this is still something where, Ambassador, I'm not convinced that really this bilateral way is the way forward that will bring greater stability in the region.
Thank you very much. I would now like to open the floor for your questions and comments. We will start with a question by Lün Kuok, who is a member of the Munich Young Leaders class of 2013 and a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And then maybe you can direct your question to one or maximum two of our panelists, because otherwise we will have not enough time to take more questions. Thank you.
I'd just like to say that I'm no longer at the CSIS. I was visiting there, and now I'm back at Harvard Kennedy School.
Okay.
Ambassador Zhou, thank you very much for what you mentioned earlier, and also to the rest of the panelists. But my question is directed to you. You mentioned earlier that China is doing its best to avoid conflict in the East China Sea, and it's really up to Japan to adopt a more positive attitude. A key element, of course, in avoiding conflict is being able to put oneself in the other's shoes to see how the other side perceives your actions. And from this perspective, the declaration by China of the ADIZ over the weekend, I think you would agree with me, is clearly a step in the wrong direction in terms of perceptions that it creates. I think countries have come out to say that it was provocative. It is provocative. Can you speak about the strategic calculations behind China's decisions to declare the ADIZ? And also, could you also talk about concrete steps China is taking to increase trust between Japan and China in this respect? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will take a second question and then we can answer. Wang Yiwei, please.
As I just mentioned, the problem...
No, so sorry, can we have another question and then Wang Yiwei, please? And please also tell us whom you ask your question.
Thank you. I answer your question. My name is Wang Yiwei from Renmin University of China. You raised the question why China cannot sue the case into international court to solve their dispute with Japan and the South China Sea. I try to answer this question too. If this can solve the problem, we are happy to do so, but it cannot solve the problem because China claimed the South China Sea 1947. We dropped the U line. During that time, no objections from either U.S. side or Vietnam and other. But the problem is 1982, when the United Nations Sea Law draft and they ratified in 1995 and encouraged many countries to claim more territory in the South China Sea. So this makes this dispute more serious. But the international sea law cannot solve this dispute, the sovereignty dispute, said very clearly that it cannot change the original situation. So we cannot solve this problem, rely on the international sea law. But the problem is we need more international assistance to solve this problem. But in Asia, the problem is there's the hub-spoken system during after the Second World War. This is a bilateral airline system, which is exclusive to China and other stakeholders like the European Union. So this situation makes the Asian security problems, that the security rely on US, but the economy more relies China, so-called the Asian paradox. So in this regard, I think I personally initiate that there should be a maritime security cooperation like Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the continent, which should play all the stakeholders, including EU, to negotiate and talking of the crisis management in this region. That depends on the U.S. position because the U.S. not ratified the United Nations international sea law and other international commitments. That's a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Zhou.
You see, it's very difficult to introduce more at this moment. I think if you look at the history of relations between China and Japan, we established diplomatic relations in 1972. At that time, the leaders of our two countries agreed to shelve out the dispute over the Diaoyu Islands and let it to be resolved by the generation, next generation of our two countries. Perhaps the next generation will be more wise. So it is Japan challenge this consensus between the leaders of our two countries reached 40 years back. I advise Japan to learn from our host, Germany, about your attitude towards the Second World War, your attitude to Nazi Germany. Your former chancellor, when he kneeled down between the victims of the Nazi regime during Second World War II, if the Japanese government learned something from you, and if they succeeded in learning you really in your attitude, then Japan can play its responsible role in Asia among its neighbors. It will improve relations not only with China, but also with ROK and other victims of Japanese aggression during the Second World War II. I would like to say, is Japan have differences with not only with China, but also with ROK, with DPRK, with Russia as well. But you pay less attention to these differences. You single out or highlight the small things between China and Japan. Mm-hmm. So I advise our friends to look the general picture, the general tendency, the aspiration of the people of Asia for peace, for friendship, for cooperation, for stability. I think there is a broad scope for cooperation with China and Europe as a whole, and also with Germany in particular, because we have no land disputes, we have no frictions over maritime interests. So I think Germany, as you mentioned at the beginning of the forum, can play more positive active role in promoting the understanding between China and your country and the EU as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, Dr. Sukma, and then we need to hear a Japanese voice,
sure.
I think.
I would like to respond to this question. I think it's too early and also not wise, to say that the UNCLOS cannot, resolve, the dispute. Because you have dispute, you either resolve it outside the court or inside the court. Outside the court, through this ASEAN process, the code of conduct, great if we can do that. But, within the so-called, the court, then UNCLOS is the only things that we have, right? So there should be a basis for, this, say, settlement within the court. Whether the claimant parties will resort to court or not, that's a different story. But I don't think that it's wise to say that forget about UNCLOS is useless, it's rubbish. So that's the international law that we have, and then we need also to look at in the possibility of how that can actually resolve if possible the South China Sea issue. Even though now we still prefer the so-called settlement out of court. Through the negotiation on the code of conduct. So I just want to say that to make it very clear that I think we should not undermine UNCLOS.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself quickly.
Thank you for giving the opportunity to make some comment on the question. And I'm a Japanese, so I will not criticize my friends, our friends. I believe it's the Japanese way. And, but I want to make some comment again about the ADIS, Air Defense Identification Zone, because I have a 32 years career in JMSDF as a pilot. And I also was naval attaché in China for 3 years. And I also was chief of intelligence section in Maritime Staff Office. Now, at first, Japan, of course, has the reason to say the Senkaku Island is Japanese territory, but you can see all of the reason on the web page of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so I don't have to say anything here. But in these days, China set the Addis in East China Sea, but I think it is not bad for Japan because China showed us the standard of procedure, how to treat the aircraft in East China Sea. And Addis is quite different from the territorial air. No countries can use the military force without the identification. This is gave us the standard to judge the Chinese movement activities in East China Sea. If the Chinese Air Force try to exclude the aircraft from other countries, it is quite strange, and we can claim the Chinese side easily. So what we have to watch on is the operation itself, not the Addis itself. The problem is the both countries are claiming the sovereignty on the island, Senkaku Island itself. But the Addis, it's not the Addis. And I would like to ask the Dr. Heusgen, because I think I have the many opportunity to discuss with U.S. friends. I also think it's very difficult to let multilateral security framework works in Asian region because, as Ambassador Zhou said, it's very complicated.
Can I ask you to ask a question because I have some more? Thank you.
I think the network of bilateral security framework can work in this region, but we still need the support from European countries because European countries has the experience, especially after the Cold War. So I would like to ask you what is the role to support Asian countries to build the new type of security framework? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That goes well with one question I have from Twitter. It comes from the South China Sea News in Berlin. And the question is, the EU called to settle South China Sea claims visiting international arbitration. What support can Germany offer to parties that consider this route? It also goes to Christoph Heusgen, I think. I would like to take another question here, please. Maybe wait for the microphone.
First of all, I should like to express my thanks to all panelists for their nice presentations. And I have two questions to Ambassador Zhou. Well, the first question is, since Japan is asking Chinese side to resume the consultation on the confidence building measures with the view to establishing the mechanism to avoid any accidental incidents between two countries. But so far we have no complete response from Chinese side. What are the reasons for the hesitation on part of China? And my second question is regarding the ownership of Senkaku Islands. Japan integrated these islands in accordance with international law peacefully to the Japanese territory after having investigated thoroughly and confirmed that these islands were under no administration of any country those days. And then for a certain period of years, there have been Japanese residents. There are several Japanese living there for some fish products and so on and so forth. And I mean, after the Second World War, the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which concluded the war state between Japan and the Allies, clearly stated that these Senkaku Islands belonged to Japan, which were then for a certain period under the administration of the United States, and these islands have been returned to the Japanese administration when Okinawa Islands have been returned to Japan from the United States. And it's only when I mean, the UN organization has detected possible natural resources around the Senkaku Islands at the beginning, I mean, towards the end of 1960s, and then all of a sudden China has made claims on the ownership of these territories. So, but until then, we had no record of Chinese claims. How do you explain the absence of the records for more than 70 years?
Thank you very much. I'm glad that we now had the chance to not only listen to the Chinese version, but also to the Japanese version. I would like to finish this panel with Christoph Heusgen and then Ambassador Zhou to answer this very quickly. But please keep your answers limited because we have only two minutes.
We really want
to
improve relations with Japan. But for consolidations between the top leaders, there needs some conditions. If the leader of one country wear the military costume used by the Royal Japanese Army during the Second World War II, if this leader climb upon the tank number 731, the number is a military unit stationed in China responsible for Victoria War. They make the medical experience on the human being of the Chinese people. If the leaders claimed to revise its constitution, following the example of the Nazis, so do you think that the condition is good, is right for consultations for all the two leaders?
Ambassador, thank you very much. Even if China does not want to use international arbitration mechanism, you should at least listen to the moderator. No, I was just making a joke because at first I wanted to give the word to Christoph Heusgen. Christoph, you have the last word.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I said at my first intervention, this is always difficult when you want, from European experience, draw conclusions to situations in other continents. So, taking this into consideration, I would nevertheless say that Ambassador Zhou, insofar as I consider, his remarks as important when he relates to, let's say, the basis which we have in Asia on which these conflicts take place. What I mean with this is, of course, that one has the impression from the outside that countries in the region have not dealt with the past the same way it has done in Europe, and this is maybe makes it more difficult to come to the kind of resolution that you have asked that could be. So to say it more clearly, for me it is not, I still today don't understand the logic why Japanese leaders have to visit regularly the Yasukuni shrine. But now, with regard to the question, I think what we can advise when you say, well, the EU system of multilateral institution resolution doesn't work, and you think that bilateral it works better. First, I'm of the different opinion. I think also in Asia it can work in multilateral fora. But we have also had on questions regarding the situation on the sea, we have had problems very recently. We just took Croatia into the European Union, and to get Croatia into the European Union, they had to resolve sea borders crisis. And then, so what Slovenia and Croatia didn't do is send their Marines out there to face off one each other, but they decided with European arbitration actually to go to an arbitration and say that they will then also to submit themselves to a decision by arbitrators, and they said that then afterwards they will recognize this or go to their parliaments and have it ratified. But this is what we would propose also to resolve the issues. If, as the gentleman said before, the tribunal on the law on the sea cannot handle the island question, nevertheless, you will always find, and there I think Germany would be ready, European Union would be ready to assist if we were asked to have arbiters in a court or in arbitration set up, and we would like to help. But as I said at the beginning, the culture has to be there, the atmosphere has to be to do it in such a way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank again our 5 panelists for a very interesting discussion and a very lively discussion. Please remain seated because Klaus has to make some important announcements.